You know, there's some people you hear speak and you just realize what a rare privilege it is to listen to this person, because they're just the ideas are coming out at quite a pace, but they're exactly dead right, and they're just are really clear when they come out of that speaker's mouth, and that is Dr. Tom Martin. He's a philosophy professor from the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. It's Kearney, Nebraska. How many people have been to Kearney, Nebraska? There's one. A couple. Not you, Tom. No, Linda. No, you don't qualify. Okay. You know, you don't go there on your way to it. It's not on the way to anything else. It's just you go there to say you've been there, and it's in the middle of all kinds of like the cornfields and stuff. And so, you know, what kind of philosophy could be taught there? You know, it boggles the mind. And so does Tom Martin. He's a fantastic speaker. He's actually built a fantastic philosophy department out there. He's known among philosophy grad students that I know that went other places that met some of his students who said, "That guy? You had that guy speak at your conference?" Yes. He's like 8 feet tall. But I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to make tall jokes or anything like that, because he's always getting abused, you know, and he's always has to suffer because he's tall. So we're not going to go there. He teaches young people to think, and has a genius to use people like Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn in his philosophy courses, and to get people to read the brothers Karamazov and Ivan Denisovich and the First Circle and other things that he's talked about. You know, this is an exceptional teacher, exceptional speaker. It's his third time back here, and if I could have this guy back every year, I would, because he's just one of the people I pretty much hang on his every word. Sorry, Tom, that's not much of an introduction, but I'd like to just save this one. So please introduce Dr. Tom Martin.
Thank you. I don't know who you were talking about. I'd like to meet him. Look, that's what Socrates said in the Apology. I don't know whose words those were. Who you were talking about? Thank you very much for Lou for having me here, and for Dale and everybody who's the Chestertonians over the years who I've watched this whole thing grow into what it's become today. And it's amazing to watch this over a 30 or 40 year period. 40 years ago when I was in graduate school, the only copy of Chesterton I could buy was at a used bookstore. They ordered me a copy of Heretics. It cost me $28.50 for a bound, about a second edition copy had been rebound. And that was the only Chesterton I could find as far as in the public marketplace. And now we've got Ignatius Press and Chesterton's everywhere. It's an incredible phenomenon in the last 35, 40 years. It's what you've seen. And with in the middle of nowhere. Like this is somewhere. I grew up in Fredonia, and I didn't think much of Buffalo then. But Rochester, come on. The middle of nowhere. It's an interesting thing, the phenomena of where we are. And my students always think it's the greatest insight in the world when I always point out you were always right here. Then I walk over here and go, oh, I'm right here. And it's always been that way because the here of the moment you're in is the eternal now, which belongs to God. And we as fallen creatures have fallen into time, where there's suffering, death, weakness of the will, and weakness of intellect. Remember Father Stanley Lackey, was that his name?
Yeah.
Talked at the G.K. Chesterton Conference. Very humble man, very humble priest. No, I'm not, if you were there, you know what I mean. But to point that out, that it is always right now, and we're in time, we've got this imbecilic idea, Chesterton said, of thinking that a 13th century creed couldn't hold in the 20th century. Thanks to Marxism, the idea that we're progressing through time, that we're developing with each generation, that history is like a big ball rolling, and it crushes everything that came before it, and each new generation is further along, moving towards this glorious workers' paradise. And because of technology and things, your children are smarter than you, and once you die, you'll be crushed under, and all of history will be forgotten. And this wheel just rolls on. So the present moment is greater than anything that has ever been behind us. In preparing for isms, a Chestertonian look at what surrounds us, I was paging through what's wrong with the world and was quickly hemmed in by jingoism, optimism, feminism, collectivism, socialism, militarism, imperialism, idealism, fanaticism, relativism. Then I looked at the poster for the conference and saw a list of even more isms. Freudianism, racism, sexism, Mediafidianism. I didn't know that one. I didn't understand. My mind at this point was aggravated, to say the least, until G.K. Chesterton came to the rescue. Some people do not like the word dogma. Fortunately, they are free, and there is an alternative for them. There are two things, and two things only for the human mind: a dogma and a prejudice. The Middle Ages was a rational epoch, an age of doctrine. Our age is at best a poetic epoch, an age of prejudice. A doctrine is a definitive point, a prejudice is a direction. The doctrine of the incarnation is a dogma, a definite point. And all these aforementioned isms are ideologies formulated by men about the ends and the purpose of human life and culture. And what they are built on is contrary to reason. Contrary to reason. The doctrine of the incarnation is a dogma. The very time we live in is marked from the incarnation, the birth of Christ. The very date and time. In modern history, they've done away with BC and AD. Now it's before the Common Era and after the Common Era. I'll have these students recite this to me. They do, they've learned in history now. So in other words, before you were in the year of our Lord, and now you're in the Common Era, which means you've returned to being a commoner. They took you back to being a peasant. Not a new idea. Did away with God. With this in mind, I choose to examine the ism of relativism, which is the most inclusive of the isms. For as a prejudice, it goes every direction at once, not recognize anything as definitive when confronting with one's own ego and desires. A relativist. Alan Bloom was spot on in The Closing of the American Mind, written almost 30 years ago. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes or says he believes that truth is relative. If this belief is put to the test, one can count on his students' reactions. They will be uncomprehending. That anyone should regard the proposition as not self-evident astonishes them. Relativism is necessary to openness, and this is the virtue, the only virtue, which all primary education for more than 50 years, now it's 80, has dedicated itself to inculcating. The point is not to correct the mistakes and really be right. Rather, it is not to think you were right at all. The students, of course, cannot defend their opinions. It is something with which they have been indoctrinated. They have drank the Kool-Aid. Pope Benedict chose this when he noted, "How many winds of doctrine have we known in recent decades? And how many ideological currents," pizza coming up, "and how many ways of thinking? The small boat of the thought of many Christians has often been tossed about by these waves, flung from one extreme to another, from Marxism to liberalism, from collectivism to radical individualism, from atheism to a vague religious mysticism, from agnosticism to cynicism, and so forth. Every day new sects spring up, and what St. Paul says about human deception and the trickery that strives to entice people into error comes true." The great image. We Christians are in this small boat, and the waves around us are blowing our ship everywhere, our boat everywhere. My church, I don't know about your church, is very traditional design. It is, we sit in the nave, which is the bark, which means Chesterton's got that wonderful image of the church standing on its head. So a Catholic church is that way. You're literally sailing on the air is what you're sailing on. Upside down ship, you're sailing on the air. The Holy Spirit is where you're moving. And all around you, of course, they're flipped upside and they're in the waves of doctrine moves them. There's no rudder on this ship. They go every which way at once, and they're all tolerant of each other, celebrating each other's diversity, and they're all open to any idea whatsoever. An open mind, in that sense, is the same as having no mind whatsoever, because your mind never comes to a point that is fixed and solid. Going on with Benedict. Today, having a clear faith based on the creed of the church is often labeled as fundamentalism, whereas relativism, that is, letting oneself be tossed here and there, carried about by every wind of doctrine, seems the only attitude that can be coped with in modern times. We are building a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate goal consists solely of one's own ego and desires. It's all about just satisfying your desires. You're not led by a mind at all, you're led by your wants, your desires. Allow me to share a scene with you from a day in my life as a teacher confronting the dictatorship of relativism. I walk out of my office on the second floor with the 17 students lining the wall before class. All but one of them is fiddling with a smartphone, texting or watching a movie piped through high-end headphones. No one notices me. I go down the steps to meet my Philosophy 188 class, The Meaning of Life. At the bottom of the steps, I pass the same girl who's been seated there all semester. She's coloring in a princess costume on what looks to be a Barbie doll. Monday, she'd been playing solitary, and last Friday, she was fingering away to someone on her smartphone. Entering my classroom, I find the majority of my 25 students thumbing away at their phones. And all I can see in this room, nobody's turned on the lights, is their faces illuminated by their phones. You ever done when your kid put a flashlight under here? They all just kind of look. So you walk in this room with all these zombie faces, you switch on the light, the heads pop up, eyes wide open, like deer, they stare at you. I am the only acoustic thing they will see today. We are into the 6th week of Plato's Republic, and today we are reading and discussing the allegory of the cave, which depicts a form of education in 375 BC, the start of formal schooling, which looks much like American education or schooling everywhere. In the cave, people are chained to the wall. You think a lecture hall, you're sitting in a lecture hall, you're just chained to your seat. They have been there since birth. Looking at the opposite wall upon which the shadows are cast, there's a fire behind the prisoners, and between the fire and them is a ledge upon which men walk holding cut-out figures to create shadows on the wall, at which the prisoners who cannot turn their heads are staring. The men behind them talk, so the shadows are connected with voices. To pass the time, the prisoners see who can remember the order of the shadows that are streaming before and award prizes to those who are correct. Obviously, there's no way to verify the passage or the sequence of events or the shadows having anything to do with reality. But it is the only reality the prisoners know. Like in a lecture hall. At my campus, what they'll do is they'll allow students to put screens on in class. The University of Omaha World Herald recently had a picture of a lecture hall at UNL, which is the big time campus, football gods of the world. Most of the students were looking at shopping, looking at Facebook, while the teacher was lecturing behind him. A friend of mine who did a student teaching at a little school called Amherst, to the north of us, went in his first day, and it was about the fourth week when he entered as an English teacher, and the teacher was standing in the hall of the classroom he was supposed to go into, and he's a little bit late, about 5 minutes late. He looked in the door, and all the students were sitting there doing a web-based course online with their computers, and my students said, what am I supposed to do? He said, well, you can go in and look and see what they're doing. And he walked in and looked. All the boys were on porno, and the girls were shopping. And he came back out in the hall, and looked at the teacher, and he said, you know what's going on? He said, yeah, but I can't do anything about it. They're taking an online course from my university, University of Nebraska-Kearney, English literature course. If you just look through that door, the eyes quiet, they're smiling, the boys are smiling at literature. Isn't this wonderful? In my class, the rule, no screens whatsoever. I see a screen, I throw you out of class. First day I sound like a basketball coach. This is the rule. And he buzzes and he beeps, I throw you out of class. 3 absences, you fail. Never do I have any problem with screens whatsoever. Just run it like athletics, you can do it well. Use the athletic model when you teach, you have no problem at all. Coach them, tell them. Can you imagine taking a smartphone to volleyball practice? Because you make it notify your parents. That's not going to work. But just a model. One day back to the prison camp where I teach. One of the prisoners' chains breaks and he's free to turn around. The firelight hurts his eyes, but with time he sees the men holding up images and hypothesizes the cutout copies or copies of the real figures on the wall. That's the first hypothesis the student would make. This is Plato's allegory of the cave, but 25 centuries ago. That's the first thing the mind would be able to do. That's the beginning of thought that makes a hypothesis. Never done that before. He eventually is pulled out of the cave in the allegory against his will. And the students can relate to that. You don't go to school because you want to. After a certain age, your parents drug you there. And they won't let you live at home now in the basement, so that's why you're in college. And I can count most of you maybe read 2 books in your whole life. And they may have been Cliff Notes. So when you see a Chesterton Academy coming, run to it. You'll create a revolution. He's pulled out of the cave, he walks into reality. The allegory is the movement, Socrates explains, of the soul upward from the thoughtless acceptance of images projected on a blank wall by thought controllers to the wisdom which comes from the direct knowledge of reality outside the cave. The students in today's class see the allegory as comparable to the visual images of televised media, including the auditory accompaniment by politicians, teachers, ministers, parents, etc., who control the sights and the sounds while fueling the fire, that reach the captive mind of those who cannot remain unchained from whatever is titillating their eyes or stimulating their ears, thus adding up to a smoke-filled picture of a gullible mind. Socrates uses the allegory to show the state of affairs between ignorance, opinion, and knowledge. Knowledge of reality is in the sunlight. Opinion is the hazy shadows, and ignorance is the state of darkness into which all men are born. Every generation is equally born ignorant. We've got this idea, Chesterton will note, that there's an advancement in the human mind with time. No, we're all born ignorant. Opinions easily hold sway over the multitude who lack the necessary self-control to disconnect from the events streaming 24/7 ad infinitum in the cave land. This is 24 centuries ago. In other words, in the cave, your mind is the screen. So if we douse the fire, what do you have to look at? What would that be from Baton Rouge? What would that be? That's okay.
I don't know what I'm supposed to say.
Well, you're a good student. I'll tell you what to say. You repeated A, B, C, D, E. You can just circle in the answer for me. That's
What
enough.
about metanoia?
Huh?
Turning around, metanoia. I think I may be getting ahead of the program, but I'd say the word metanoia.
Metanoia, but without that screen, what's on your mind?
Nothing.
Nothing. Darkness. Nihilism, which is another philosophy. Much like the modern student. You unplug that student, cannot be alone with itself. Cannot be alone with the silence. Because there is nothing there. Nothing. Has to be a song, has to be an image, has to be some beat. There's nothing there. Chesterton in one place says at the beginning of one book, never have we been busier. And we were all sitting in a traffic jam. Never have we had more technology and access to information and more mindlessness. Ever in human history. Is smartphone 10 out now? 10? Are we up to 10?
7.
7?
Yeah.
It's Galaxy 7, iPhone 7.
Oh, good. That's good to know. Do they sell those in Rochester? 'Cause I'm going to come to Rochester. Shuffle off to Rochester. No, Buffalo. Shuffle off to Buffalo. What songs they have about Rochester? Rochester and Jack Benny, right? That's not okay. Don't be too old. Class ends. Many of my students are back to fingering phones, are talking on their smartphones, make their way to the door. I walk out into the hall bustling with students, but mostly quiet, reattaching to a variety of screens, eager as spelunkers, grasping for fresh air. I almost trip over a student lodged on the third step, hunkered over some device. As I make my way up to the top of the second floor and come upon a headphoned student seated in a chair watching a movie. Before I enter my office, I bump into a girl, and to my surprise, she says, "I love you." She is on her iPhone, of course. At a moment in nowhere. As you can see, I've just been in Plato's cave with the students whose minds are being formed by little more than the events streaming before a field of visions and handheld devices. The next class will be different. I'm going to unchain one of these puppies. And they always know who Jeffrey Dahmer is. And I don't know why that would be. They like him. They think he's a historical figure. The AKA Milwaukee cannibal who raped, murdered, and dismembered 17 men and boys, with many of the other later murders involving necrophilia and cannibalism and the permanent preservation of body parts in a freezer. So next class I go in and ask sweet Melissa sitting in the front row, "Melissa, do you know who Jeffrey Dahmer is?" "I do. He murdered young boys and ate them." "Good. That's a fact." "Did Jeffrey Dahmer do anything wrong?" "I think he did." "That is fine and good, Melissa, but Jeffrey Dahmer does not think he did anything wrong. So was he wrong?" "Yes, I think he was wrong." "Was he wrong because you think he was wrong, or was he wrong?" "What he did was illegal. It's against the law." They always do the jump. If you want to have the argument with them, they'll jump from it's not my, it's not, everybody else does it, it's legal. That'll be the next move of the relativistic mind. It's legal. And who makes the laws? The government. So if the government says it's legal, it is wrong to do what Jeffrey Dahmer did. Yes. Suppose, Melissa, you're a young girl in Hitler's Germany in 1933 and have been formed on his doctrine. And I quote from Hitler, "My program for educating youth is hard. Weakness must be hammered away." This is not the Chesterton Academy, but similar but not the same. "In my castles of Teutonic order, a youth will grow up before which the world will tremble. I want a brutal, domineering, fearless, cruel youth. Youth must be, at all times, it must bear pain. There must be nothing weak and gentle about it. The free, splendid beast of prey must once again flash from its eyes. This is how I will eradicate thousands of years of human domestication. This is how I will create a new order." Hitler. At this week's meeting, the group leader charged with creating a new order commands the youth group to report the names of everyone who is Jewish or even suspected of being Jewish. You have been friends, Melissa, with the neighbor's daughter, Clara Lowenstein, your entire life. She's your best friend. In order to be a member in good standing, will you turn her in? And this is all legal. I would not do that. I am not a member of the Hitler Youth Group. Melissa, for the sake of argument, pretend, Melissa, you're a good German member of Hitler's Youth Group. Have you done anything wrong? Not as a member of Hitler's Youth Group, but I would not do that sort of thing. But as a good member of Hitler's Youth Group, has he done anything wrong in her eyes? Has she done anything wrong? No. But in your eyes, she has done something wrong. Yes. So she is right in her eyes, and you are right in your eyes. Who is right? Reluctantly, Melissa says, we both are. How can this girl be both right and hold contradictory positions? Blank stare. End of the discussion. Be Socratic with them. Unchain them from the wall, ask them a question, and just see where they go with it. In order to unchain Melissa and her fellow students from relativism in which they have been indoctrinated and so eagerly swallow, we continue a close reading of Plato on into Book 8 to show that when a person holds virtue as relative, he is one step away from having his soul being ruled by a tyrant. Let me explain. A tyrant lives by the idea that might makes right. And he does not give two hoots for the idea of truth being relative or the altruistic corollaries that everyone ought to be tolerant of diverse ideas or that one ought to celebrate the lifestyles of others. It is important that the modern students see that the contradiction when stating truth is relative, there must be one truth which is true, and that is that there is no truth, and that's their truth. The mind has to have a point. It has to have a point from which it moves, and that's the point they move from, that there is no truth, and that's the truth. Listen as Socrates describes the soul of a relativist, the Glaucon, who is a relativist. He's describing, in the Plato's Republic, he always gives you a picture of the city-state, and then he gives you the soul of the person who goes in the city-state. And there's 5 types of souls. He says there could be more, but I'll give you 5 types. This is the democratic soul. He lives on, yielding day by day to the desire at hand. Sometimes he drinks heavily while listening to hip-hop. No, it's the flute in this one. But I put hip-hop. At other times he drinks only water and is on a diet. Sometimes he goes in for physical training. At other times he's idle and neglects everything. And sometimes he even occupies himself with what he takes to be philosophy. He often engages in politics, leaping up from his seat and saying and doing whatever comes to mind. And if he happens to admire soldiers, he's carried in that direction. If moneymakers, in that one. There's neither order nor necessity in his life, but he calls it pleasant, free, and blessedly happy, and he follows it for as long as he lives. And Glaucon, upon hearing this, he says, "You've perfectly described the life of a man who believes in legal equality." Legal equality. As though the government can make everybody equal. There it is. This passage is found in Book 8 of Republic, in which the constitutions of the democratic city and the soul of the democratic man are described. Of the 5 constitutions of the city, states, and republic, and the individuals housed within each, which are present in descending order from the highest to the lowest, the democratic state is the 4th from the top, one step away from tyranny, which is the city-state where men are ruled by erotic love. Plato explains the soul as tripart: reason, spirit, and desire. Reason and desire are understood as rational and irrational parts of the soul. The former part calculates, and the latter part lust, hungers, thirsts, gets excited by other appetites, concupiscence. Man by nature has an end, a telos, at which he aims to fulfill the constitution he's within. Man's end is known by reason, and he is a creature who lives by ideas. A just man, a man in full, is governed by the rational part of his soul, which directs him to act in a virtuous manner, such that every part of him performs its proper function, because reason controls the inferior part of his nature. The just state is realized when the person is performing his proper function and not meddling where he does not belong. And the one idea, the principle in the Republic, which they state very early in Book 2, is that a just man never returns a harm with a harm. That's the principle in the Republic. Never return a harm with a harm. Father Shaw adamantly points that out in many of his works. If you read Father Shaw, that's the principle in the Republic that's known by reason. The just state in Republic is the ideal state which is created by Socrates' dialectic discussion with Glaucon, Polemarchus, Adimantus, Thrasymachus, and the other young men who were present for the discussion of how justice works in the soul of man. The reader obviously is also present. That is, if he's engaged. It takes me 12 weeks to read Republic with him. We just go page by page by page, argument through argument, bring him into the discussion. Very important to get the student to talk and reflect on their feet. The ideal state, the aristocracy, has never existed, but the virtues on which it is founded, justice, wisdom, courage, and moderation, are grasped by reason and do exist in the souls and actions of man. This state serves as a point of reference from which to set the extreme constitution of tyranny, its opposite, as well as the intermediate states of democracy, oligarchy, and democracy. A timocrat, the end or the telos, is honor. The oligarch is money or possessions. And in democracy, the end is freedom. That's the end, that's the telos. Everything's based off of freedom. In the timocratic soul, which is the second from the aristocratic, a timocrat is someone who would love military victories or athletic victories. And a true timocrat only wants to be honored by those who are higher than him or of equal status. So if you're a basketball player, for example, and the fans love you because you really look good in your shorts, you got a really nice move and some nice little dances when you do afterward, and the fans love you, but the coach doesn't think you're much, and you're a base timocrat, you'll go with the fans and the hell with the coach. But a true timocrat would listen to the authority, the one who knows, the musician, the teacher, the craftsman, the artist. But the base one will go with the multitude because they feed on honors. It is helpful when reading Plato to remember that man is not an animal by nature for Plato, but part of him is like an animal. Let me explain. A Gordon setter is by nature a soft-mouthed dog, ideal for retrieving birds because it does not sink its teeth into the bird. The Gordon setter is very alert, interested, and aggressive. It responds to the gun and is eager to please. Dog at home is a very good pet. A Gordon setter will not naturally retrieve birds, but can easily be trained to do so because it's within its potential, its nature to do that. If that is, the Gordon setter has been trained. It needs a teacher or a trainer. Same with human beings for Plato. Aristotle, your upbringing, your education is in you, but by nature you do not speak, but you can be taught to speak. And your level of discourse is dependent upon the teachers you have to bring out your tongue out of your mouth. And if you don't have teachers, you won't learn how to speak. You know, like, well, I mean, you got me. Oh, what you mean? I'm telling you, boy. Huh? I live in Missouri sometimes too. You go there. What you gonna do? How you spell that? What you gonna do? Not their fault. They've been raised that way. A lot of it, there's no education in their life. That's them. That's where they can still be decent, virtuous people. But their mouth, that you can train. I tell my students, lift weights and take active. You'll smoke them. In America, hell with education. Just look good.
And learn to speak.
Use your body language. You can make all the money you want to in America. We're all working on image. Just tell them they don't look that good. You can help them. When my girls come home, so much shampoo in the bathroom, in the shower, all because those girls think their hair is just not that good looking. When they get older, for a surprise, it's going to change colors. I'm going to go there anyway. Even in nowhere, we need to take a sip of water occasionally. Erewhon was the novel, wasn't it? Nowhere? Erewhon? Nowhere? Who wrote that? Do you remember? Samuel Butler, was it?
Yeah.
That was a good book. Nowhere. Nebraska. Kearney. Man is like an animal in that he also needs instruction to reach his potential. Man, like a dog, comes in a variety of breeds. However, being well bred for a man is different from having the pedigree of a Gordon setter. Man's pedigree is revealed by the performance of his function, which has been handed down to him in the stories of his virtuous ancestors. Unlike a Gordon setter, man does not inherit his pedigree. It is something he achieves by learning his function. This is Plato. Each person has a variety of functions. If he's a cobbler, obviously an ancient example, as cobblers have gone the way of bare feet that stop grapes. He makes shoes, and if he's a virtuous cobbler, he makes good shoes. With Plato, very important in the Greek world, it really helps these students. Everything has a function. The function of this bottle is to hold water. If it does it well, that's its virtue. It makes it a virtuous water bottle. A human being, everything has a function. This podium's function is the orator can rest their papers upon there. It's obviously inferior because it's made for a child.
Thanks, Lou.
And nowhere they're the right height. Being a virtuous human being is a question of being well ordered. In this case, order is a word which signifies a harmonious arrangement, first in the soul, which is the moral order, then in the city-state, which is the constitutional order. Reason is the ruling element in the soul which grasps moral principles and enduring standards, and the moral norms of man's nature which are necessary for self-examination. Inasmuch as the moral principles are enduring, they are divine and not created by man. You should never return a harm with a harm. It's a moral principle. The soul sees it. C.S. Lewis, I believe, in his book, at the end of it, let's see, he has the Tao, the way, men without chest, the abolition of men. At the end, he has this part called the Tao, the way, where he goes through different places, Confucianism, Buddhism, the Indian sutras, the Egyptian tales, and it shows all these common moral ideas that are all through civilizations. That's what the Greek can see. The soul can see these things together. Which brings us back to the soul of the Democrat, a free spirit whose soul is not guided by moral principle. He lacks the ability to distinguish higher from lower, right from wrong, and good from evil. In a democratic soul, reason is the handmaid of desire, the inferior part of man's nature. Thus he lives on in yielding day by day to the desire at hand. The Democrat uses his intellect to rationalize whatever desire he craves at the moment. He cannot truly discriminate between his necessary and unnecessary desires. In effect, each desire has a say. Flannery O'Connor, in one of her works, I think maybe The Habit of Being, says man does not have one will, he has many wills. It's a multi-headed beast. Plato will talk about a hydra head. So you've got hundreds of wills in you, all screaming for attention at once. And if you can't control yourself, these wills all take over. So you're just led by the passion of the moment. I call it the philosophy of I like it like that. Why'd you do that? I like it like that. Babe. I was in Italy last year with my wife, and the Italians are listening to hip hop, and they're trying to act like they're gangster rappers, but the Italian men have a problem. They're in love with their hair, and they wear scarves. The gangsters I know don't spend a lot of all the time quaffing their hair and wearing scarves and looking really good from the neck up. They have their pants all down like this, trying to be bad, which means good. But I was looking for violins. All I hear is hip hop music. Great. How do you be a lead guitarist in such a band with the sound of what are we doing here? That's just your opinion, Dr. Martin. Yeah, you got it. It's always an opinion. The democratic, this in the soul of Plato describes what a pleasant constitution is, which lacks rulers but not variety, which distributes a sort of equality to both equals and unequals alike. That's the important part, the idea. A form of equality for equals and unequals alike. That's the form of equality it has. The democratic city-state is similar to the democratic soul. Everyone is treated equal. At first glance, it seems a fine constitution, like a coat embroidered with every ornament, because it has every kind of character type. With such diversity, could it be anything but wonderful? However, in the city and the soul, which lives by the idea of treating people equals and unequals alike, condemned criminals walk about freely, and foreigners have the rights of citizens. Plato, 24 centuries ago. But the obligations of the citizens to vote or serve on juries and in the military are such that if they don't feel like doing it, they don't have to. The democratic soul turns inward and neglects its public responsibility. In fact, it does not have a sense of community. It has nothing in common with those within its city, others than being guided by the desires which cry to be heard and feel the need to be satisfied. I like it like that. Thus, the democratic soul, as well as the democratic city, lacks rulers and is opposed to any form of authority other than the pressing momentary urge. So, he drinks heavily while listening to the flute. At other times, he drinks only water and is on a diet. Sometimes he goes in for physical training, and other times he neglects it. He's idle and neglects everything, and sometimes even occupies himself with which he takes to be philosophy. His mind is not led by moral principles. An example of a principle is the one I gave at the beginning of the Republic. You should never return a harm with a harm. And what Plato does so wonderfully is you see the soul of a democratic person, they are always returning a harm unto a harm within themselves. In other words, they're their own worst enemy. Plato can see very clearly the only person who can harm you is you, in that sense, very Christian sense. No one can sin for you or be virtuous and loving. The democratic father, for example, refuses to accept the guiding principle in the soul as it would be an infringement upon the equality of his children to fulfill their immediate desires. And I quote, "Thus a father accustoms himself to behave like a child and fears his sons. And while the son behaves like a father, feeling neither shame nor fear in front of his parents in order to be free." Let's examine the vocabulary. The democratic soul sees freedom as being free from as opposed to free to. So he is free from responsibility, and he does what he feels at the moment. It is important to notice that the father behaves like a child. The emphasis is on behave, as the father does not act. For to act, one needs to have a will, to know what he is doing, making him the author of his action. The democratic father behaves because he is motivated by desire and not by principle. He exercises until it becomes painful, boring, or another desire clamors to be satisfied. The son behaves like a father. He does not act like a father, but becomes like a father because of a demanding nature or authority adolescence desires rising up in his soul at the moment. As the Son is defiant of authority, all tradition, the ways of his ancestors, is denied as being outdated and confining to his freedom to serve his desires. The democratic teacher, next in line in the tradition of authority over the young, fares equally as well as the father. And I quote, "A teacher in such a community is afraid of his students and flatters them, while the students despise their teachers." 24 centuries ago. The teacher is afraid of the students because he has no right to impose his knowledge, all opinions being equal, upon the students. Furthermore, the student despises the teachers for presuming to think that they know more than the students. It is best for the students, in the words of Bob Dylan, to let their teachers know what they have told their parents. Bob Dylan. Come, mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. He done cried you, mother. Beyond your command. I used to love that guy. I like it like that. But anyway. The democratic ruler, ascending in authority in order to gain his position, need only tell the citizens, and I quote, that he wishes the majority well. Which means the citizens of the democratic state will be free to continue doing whatever they desire, be it reading Milton or looking at website pornography, being faithfully married or committing adultery, paying taxes or not, having children or aborting babies, helping the sick and the aged or euthanizing them. It's all the same. Thus, and I quote, "The person who is honored and considered clever and wise and important in matters by such acts in badly governed cities is the one who serves them most pleasantly, indulges them, flatters them, anticipates their wishes, and is clever in fulfilling them." So all you have to do is fulfill the desires of your constituency. Sensual desires is what you aim at. Legalize marijuana. The soul of the Democrat is in turmoil as reason is subservient to a multitude of desires, unrestrained by the virtue or moderation, and above all authority. The words which correctly name the virtues have been distorted by this character. Listen as I quote Socrates. "Doing battle and controlling things themselves, won't they call reverence foolishness and moderation cowardice, abusing them and casting them out beyond the frontiers like disenfranchised exiles? And won't they persuade the young man that measuring an ordinary expenditure is boorish and mean, and joining with many useless desires, won't they expel it across the border? They proceed to return insolence, anarchy, extravagance, shamelessness from exile. They bring them back and give them fine names, calling insolence good breeding, anarchy freedom, extravagance magnificence, and shamelessness courage." Change all the language, just flip it. What we now have is an uncontrollable adolescence, refusing authority and revering nothing. The distortions of his head visit the body, and he ages, lacking self-control. His health deteriorates, so he thinks the functions of physicians is restore that which he has abused. All the money spent on healing is of no use. He ends up blaming the abysmal quality of physicians and the source of his feeling ill. As Socrates notes, "And isn't it amusing that they consider their worst enemy to be the person who tells the truth, namely, that until you give up drunkenness, overeating, lechery, idleness, no medicine, cautery, or surgery, no charms, ambulance, or anything else of that kind will do you any good." The democratic soul is obsessed with the idea of tolerance, which becomes its virtue. So it naively treats all desires as deserving equal attention. This is the intellectual position. However, when the desires has replaced right-minded reason in the soul, what the head thinks to be the case is secondary to the demands of the body. So while the head is tolerant of all desires being equal, the depraved desire of erotic love, the antithesis of philosophy, which is the love of wisdom, consumes the soul. The elements of authority is impotent in the soul of the democrat, He's idle and neglects everything, I quote, and sometimes it even occupies himself with what he takes to be philosophy. The perversion of a democratic soul's attempt at philosophy is seen in Glaucon, Polemarchus, Adimantus, and Thrasymachus, and the other young men of the dialogue. As reasonable men, they distort the ancient proverbs, friends have all things in common, to deduce that women and children are possessions and friends ought to share their possessions. In other words, we ought to have all the women in common. That's what the young men figure out, Book 5 of Republic. Under the spell of erotic love, they further decide that the best men, which they assume to be themselves, ought to have sex with the best women as frequently as possible. To keep the women from becoming attached to the children, which is the natural way to act, the women are treated as equals and now share occupations alongside the men. Their children of the best men and the best women are housed in rearing pens, the ancient equivalent of a daycare center, to ensure that no mother knows her child. True to form, the children of the worst parents are left outside the rearing pen to die. The father is oblivious to his children, as those driven by erotic love feel no responsibility for their offspring or their actions. This is decided upon by the young men of Athens without consulting their mothers, sisters, or other women in town, of course. The final descent in the tyranny of erotic love is seen in the confrontation between Socrates and Glaucon, the pedophiliac, to show how the egalitarian soul, in a swoon before the object of its depravity, is consumed by insatiable lust. And I quote, Socrates is looking at Glaucon. But it isn't appropriate for an erotically inclined man to forget that all boys in the bloom of youth pique the interest of the lover of boys and arouse in him that they all seem worthy of his care and pleasure. Or isn't that the way you people behave to fine and beautiful boys? You praise the snub-nosed one as cute, a hook-nosed one you say is regal. One in between is well-proportioned. Dark ones look manly, and pale ones are the children of the gods. And as for the honey-colored boy, do you think that this very term is anything but a euphemism, coinage of a lover who found it easy to tolerate shallowness, provided it was accompanied by the bloom of youth? In other words, you find all kinds of terms and excuses so as not to reject anyone whose flower is in bloom. Such is the destructive nature of erotic love. First it destroys the love between man and woman, then turns women into common possessions and resolves the dilemma of unwanted children by lodging them in rearing pens. And finally, erotic love accepts the sterile act of fornicating with the same sex in Glaucon's homosexual passion for the boys in the bloom of youth. At this point, the descent of the democratic soul is complete, and I quote, extreme freedom cannot be expected to lead to anything but a change to extreme slavery, whether for a private individual or for a city. The democratic soul is one step away from being a slave to the desires. That's what ancient slavery is. It's not just being captured in battle, but it's your body is simply control. You're taken over, and now it controls your whole being, and erotic love wins out. This type of democracy is not a virtuous form of government, inasmuch as it is one step away from tyranny. Lacking self-restraint and transfixed by the idea of equality of both equals and unequals alike, the soul is fractured, each appetite having a will and clamoring to be heard. Ultimately, the strongest desire of erotic love gives license to mad sensuality, having its way in a soul that is a slave to its mad masters. Chesterton sums up the situation very well. An open mind is really a mark of foolishness, like an open mouth. Mouths and minds were made to shut. They were made to open only in order to shut. That's from the Illustrated London News of 1908. And then in the autobiography, the object of opening the mind, as of opening the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid, like the incarnation, the point that the mind is meant to come to. Thank you from nowhere.